Investment company BlackRock are pushing for digital currencies to be centralized. Luckily, BlackRock is just some tin pot organization that don't have any power to change anything. Hello there, you 5.4 million awakening wonders. Thank you for joining me on this voyage that we undertake together to free ourselves individually, communally, collectively, in any way we possibly can. Liberate yourselves from the false narratives, from your own conditioning. De-school your mind from the madness you endured, from the inculcations of conditioning systems that you can no longer trust, if you ever could. I'm on tour at the moment. If you want to come and see me live, there's a link in the description. There's a few tickets left in a few places. It's a really good tour. You'll love it. Come if you can. Now let's get on with this bloody thing, shall we? BlackRock is a powerful investment company. If you've done any research on BlackRock, you'll know that they have incredible influence and sway. I know a lot of you are very interested in cryptocurrencies, believing that there is the power within cryptocurrencies to set up independent or at least adjacent financial systems that aren't controlled by centralized banks. But if no one wants digital currencies to be centralized, how will they organize it? How will they implement it? They wouldn't look for some weird, mad, exploitative opportunity to bring it about for morally reprehensible reasons, would they? The CEO of BlackRock, one of the biggest investment corporations in the world, thinks that the war in Ukraine and the events surrounding it could be used to accelerate the adoption of digital money controlled by central banks. That's so bad, isn't it, that you watch the war in Ukraine. There's a hospital being blown up. Humanitarian crisis. Is there any way that the rubble, the hospitals, the children, etc., could be used to accelerate the centralization of digital currencies? What? In a letter to shareholders sent on Thursday, Larry Fink wrote that this could prove to be one of the outcomes of the war that are currently, by and large, under the radar. According to Fink, whose company manages $10 trillion worth of assets, what is that written down? 10, just than this. Countries around the world will be re-evaluating what he called their currency dependencies. With the onset of the war, the US and its allies added Russia's central bank to their list of entities targeted by sanctions, which brought about a surge in transactions on centralized Bitcoin exchanges in both Russia and Ukraine, and in both of their currencies. Reports interpret this as a realization that stablecoins, cryptocurrencies whose market value is pegged to a fiat currency, gold, etc., can provide safety for assets and a way to evade sanctions. The BlackRock CEO's letter shows that the trend of major financial players starting to take cryptocurrencies seriously continues. Born out of the 2008 financial crisis, this form of money was treated with distrust and even derision for a long time. But now Fink writes that BlackRock's clients are becoming increasingly interested both in cryptocurrencies, stablecoins included, and in the blockchain tech that underpins them. So, digital currencies are transitioning from a kind of frontier technology accessible to all to an area that will soon be the dominion of centralized interest. There are probably components and aspects to digital currencies that make it somewhat beyond the conventional remit. That is why we've already done a story about Congress trying to introduce regulation, and now we are seeing investment. Don't you see this trend occur again and again? For example, with the emergence of the internet, initially it's this place of possibility and entrepreneurialism and potential power for individuals to communicate. After a while, though, it becomes mapped and controlled by the cartography of power, all things accessible through recognizable portals of power. It seems that digital currencies, which is an area that I don't claim to know a lot about, although I've spoken to experts about it on my podcast Under the Skin, I still don't really fully understand what's going on. But the idea that BlackRock are getting involved and that attempts at regulation is occurring means that it's legitimate. Also, do you recognise that trajectory? First of all, derision and laughter. Oh, this thing's rubbish. It's useless. It won't work. Oh, no, they're not buying it. They're not buying it. Shit. You better start buying that then. And for that reason, BlackRock now considers centrally controlled digital money as an emerging class of assets that the corporation is studying in a bid to serve its clients better. Fink did not say which of the many forms of cryptocurrencies BlackRock is studying, although in the past, while overall positive about the future of digital money, he didn't appear to be a big fan of decentralized and freedom-associated Bitcoin. In his letter to shareholders, he noted that even before the war in Ukraine, several governments, including the US, were looking into cryptocurrencies and ways to regulate their use. With all the rhetoric about freedom and liberty, think of Biden's recent speeches, democracy, the light of democracy. Note how when something emerges that's outside of central control, the existing pillars of power, be they state or private finance, close in on it. First trying to deride it or shut it down, and if that proves impossible, they find new ways to regulate it, own it, control it. Control and power is what control and power do best. Anything outside of their terrain, sooner or later corralled in. It'll be interesting to see how this story evolves and unfolds, whether it's possible to resist the constant colonization of new resources and new outlets. Because it's easy to envisage, and in fact it's one of the things I've been talking to people about when I'm on tour, it's possible to envisage a world where you're able to generate your own energy, perhaps through solar power, have your own off-grid living through digital currencies, like any possibility that exists to create communities and systems that are outside of the mainstream are quickly controlled and curtailed and shut down. It's very interesting to watch that unfold. Fink also stated that a thoroughly designed global digital payment system can improve international transactions, reduce cross-border payment costs, and the risk of money laundering. At the end of last year, asset management firm BlackRock broke a new record. It surpassed $10 trillion in the assets it manages. To put that sum in context, it's larger than the pre-pandemic GDP of Germany and Japan combined. So there are private entities that exist that are bigger than significant late industrialized, technologically advanced nations. So we still see the world in this sort of old-fashioned globe of countries and nations and flags and people and cultures and customs. That isn't the real world. What we see is a sort of a superficial layer of reality that's been prescribed to us. I believe, as you know, in different layers of reality accessible to consciousness. Put them to one side for now and acknowledge that there are layers of reality that dominate the material mechanics of global economics. BlackRock has more resources and therefore, one could argue, more power than Japan or Germany. You can certainly contest that there will be considerable influence. So if Larry Fink in his letter to shareholders says we're interested in centralizing digital currency or interested in investing in it, that will ultimately line up, I imagine, with the interests of regulatory forces. It will be part of a mesh of power, which will make it very difficult for cryptocurrencies to remain in any serious way independent. Yet BlackRock isn't the only behemoth asset manager in operation today. They're followed closely by Vanguard with just over $7 trillion in assets. There are these private entities that have that amount of wealth. I know that they're made up of loads and loads of different investors. I know it's like not just Monty Burns and Smithers sat there in a pile of cash with Scrooge McDuck. But I'm saying that the way that they operate is by pursuing particular agenda that are in alignment with one another. So it's a sort of a stream of reality, and it's not accessible to everybody, and it will have influence, and it will have a degree of control, and it will manipulate outcomes. BlackRock and Vanguard alone control enough assets to buy every company listed in the London Stock Exchange at least 3 times over. Bloody hell, they could buy the whole stock exchange. Then again, and then again. And only then would they say, we've run out of money now, we've got 3 stock exchanges though. Oh no, it's the same one. We should never have let you be in charge, Fink. Indeed, the combined $20 trillion in assets of the two firms represent a full fifth of the assets of an entire $100 trillion global industry spanning thousands of firms. This is a profound degree of concentration in a vast and powerful industry. It's also a recent phenomenon whose implications for political and economic power and the operating logics of contemporary capitalism we've barely begun to recognise, let alone address. It's comparable in a way to the advent of the internet, when emergent technologies, ideologies or forces emerge, there aren't concomitant governing or regulatory bodies to address it. So the power is just like a monster, like a leviathan that courses through the terrain until people can come together collectively, which, let's face it, is unlikely to happen while you can't protest and you're continually censored, in order to address it. What can confront power of that magnitude? What could conceivably ever address it? Without question, the seemingly inexorable growth and concentration within BlackRock, Vanguard, and a small cohort of other giants represents a tectonic shift in the nature of ownership, control, and corporate governance. Their power, particularly that of BlackRock, today extends far beyond financial markets and directly into the most hallowed halls of politics. Oh, well, of course it would, wouldn't it? If you've got that amount of assets, you're not going to at some point seek to influence regulatory bodies. several BlackRock alumni occupy spots in the Joe Biden administration. BlackRock received authority to allocate the Federal Reserve's corporate bond purchase program in response to COVID-19. So even when it comes to measures that are national, domestic, health crisis centered, public responsibility, it's entrusted to BlackRock because that amount of power, those amount of resources is kind of unavoidable, unignorable. I suppose comparable, although it seems much more vast, to something like Facebook. When there is that scope, that extent, it's very difficult to resist them if they say, listen, we'd like to be involved in this scheme, or we've got this idea in the field of education, or when Bill Gates and the Gates Foundation have ideas and potentially agenda I wouldn't know within the world of medicine. When you have that amount of power, it's also quite likely that there is influence. Academics have described their influence as representing a new private authority over access to capital that increasingly rivals the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Well, we did a video recently talking about loans and debt in Ukraine set up by the World Bank and International Monetary Fund. Increasingly, I think we will have to be aware of non-governmental bodies, whether they are private foundations or investment entities or unelected, privately funded, to a degree governmentally funded bodies like the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, because if your fear is increasing centralization and concentration of power, these are the kind of bodies that will facilitate that centralization. In fact, a report like that suggests that that concentration has already occurred. So it's while we live in the crazy world of flags and countries and nations and conflict and war, it's interesting to note that there are international organizations that transcend those old-fashioned 19th century versions of what territory looks like. The terrain is entirely different now. The terrain is financial. The terrain may be ideological. It may be technological, but it certainly doesn't exist on this lo-fi cultural level where we all squabble and squawk, competing for space in a world where increasingly power exists way beyond the reach of any democratic procedure. But that's just what I think. What do you think? Are you interested in digital currencies and cryptocurrencies? Does it concern you that it might soon fall under the remit of existing powerful institutions? How do we ever resist something like that? How do we set up alternative models? How can we possibly change the world when there's so much power concentrated in the hands of unaccountable private authorities? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, have a look at this one or this one. Come and see me live if you've got the time and you fancy it. There's a link in the description. Please sign up to my mailing list so we can stay in constant communication. Most importantly of all though, please stay free.